All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, I do just want to give a quick content warning, as today's event will focus on history and present of the Me Too LGBTQ conference, which focuses on supporting LGBTQ survivors of sexual assault and relationship violence. We may also discuss topics of suicide and general mental health, so we encourage all of you viewers to take care of yourselves as you need. You can go ahead and, peace out. This will be available on Facebook and YouTube afterwards if you need to take a minute to take care of yourselves. So at this time, as we get started, I'm just going to go ahead and bring our guests up. So we're all going to start by sharing our names, pronouns, and organizations. So if we can start with you, Kathleen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kay, or Kathleen Thomas, and my pronouns are they and she, and I am the Clinical Training Manager for North County Lifeline's Project Life.
And Fern, I believe yours.
My name is Fernando Lopez. I use they, them, their pronouns. I'm the Executive Director of San Diego Pride and one of the founders of the LGBTQ Survivor Task Force and the Me Too LGBTQ Conference.
And hi, my name is Sarah Diamond. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Lead Prevention and Community Engagement Specialist at Center for Community Solutions.
Excellent, thank you all. And to introduce myself, I am Jen LaBarbera. My pronouns are they and she, and I'm the Education and Advocacy Manager at San Diego Pride. I'm also a current member of the current Me Too LGBTQ Planning Committee, as are all three of these folks that are on our panel today. Before we begin with the content of our program, though, I do want to acknowledge a couple of things about today, Wednesday, September 23rd. First is a happy thing that today is Bisexual Visibility Day. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that and the connection of bi folks to the topic at hand as we get into the content. But for all of you bi plus folks and all of you who love us bi plus folks, happy Bi Visibility Day. And then second, on a point of personal privilege and just acknowledgement of the events of today. A couple hours ago, a grand jury in Louisville, Kentucky came back with their indictment and recommended charges in the killing of Breonna Taylor, which included no charges related to the actual killing of Breonna Taylor herself. Speaking personally as a biracial, non-binary woman, today is really hard. And let's be clear that regardless of what our criminal justice system says or doesn't say about us, Black lives matter and Black women matter. So now, just wanted to make sure that we took that point of personal privilege as your moderator today to acknowledge the reality of the context that we are having this conversation today. So we're going to go ahead and have a panel discussion. We have a bunch of questions that have been previously submitted. If you have questions for the panel about the conference, about the topic at hand, please feel free to throw them into the chat on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're watching. We'll try and, if we have the time, we will try and pull in some of those questions so that we can answer those as well. So we'll start with a question for the founder, one of the founders of the Me Too LGBTQ conference and the Survivor Task Force. So what's the origin story, Fernando, and how did you get connected with the other founding members of the task force?
Sure, thanks. Obviously, this is a rough part of that conversation. In 2013, I was out with friends in our community at one of our local clubs, and the next day found myself that had to be in the emergency room. I had been drugged and raped, and in our own community, and had to endure that trauma. And at each phase of that experience in attempting to acquire service and care, ran into homophobia, ran into challenges. I mean, the responding police officer in that moment, when they were there at the emergency room, said to me, so what do you want me to do about it? And so there were just very clear impasses at every stage, whether it was working with CCS, even who's here, and some of the lack of LGBTQ competent information and support, or from trying to access therapists. There was just challenges and barriers at every step of the healing process. And as I began to become more public about my experiences, or at least with close friends and community members, I heard more and more that they had also had similar experiences with sexual assault and in barriers to accessing services and care. So I spent the first year really working on myself, going to therapy, going to doctors and taking care of my physical health, my mental health. And about a year later, I was like, okay, I'm feeling great. I'm feeling, pretty repaired here. How can I lean in to do some of this work, and how can we start addressing some of these challenges? And Dr. Dolores Jacobs was the CEO at the center at the time, and had been a really wonderful sounding board and had helped to bring folks together. So I actually helped to bring together the Center for Community Solutions in San Diego Pride and the center, all three of our organizations, to do some cross-training to make sure that CCS was more LGBTQ culturally competent and that the center had more trauma-informed care. And in all of those discussions, there was another community member, Benny Cartwright, who had said, oh, I know some other folks who have had this experience. And another volunteer with San Diego Pride, who was also a leader in our community and volunteered for a lot of different organizations, had come to me and said, well, if you do something, I want to help. And so Christopher Sheehan was one of those first people and was there at that first meeting. And Walter Castaneda was the second person who was actually supposed to be here on this panel today, but he's had some health issues, so wasn't able to join us. And unfortunately, Christopher died by suicide just a month ago, and we're all still grieving his loss and our loss of his life. But that first time was, Benny Cartwright and Christopher Sheehan and Walter Castaneda and I sort of saying, yeah, these are the challenges that we're all facing and experiencing, and how do we start bringing folks together, and how do we start addressing these issues more holistically? And that was it. We started just having lunch. Okay, let's have lunch once a month and sort of map out what our needs are and what we can go back to these organizations and say that we need to thrive and to survive. And over time, we brought in the ever incredible Bix Marino Kibbe, who is just like a phenomenal mind and like brilliant human being. And Liat Wexler, who was at CCS at the time, who oh my God, another just incredible human being who I think together they really helped to elevate the work and that really sort of codified things, if you will. I think it was the addition of those two people specifically, like Bix and Liat joining that team was like, oh, now we've got some real weight behind us. So that's how it all kind of came together.
Awesome, thank you. I've heard this origin story a few times, and I don't know, I'm always pretty just in awe of the way that you, Fern, and all of the other members of kind of that founding core group, just, most, if not all of you are also survivors, and just the way that we as survivors tend sometimes to, be like, cool, yes, this is a thing that happened, and also now going to be in service to other people and create that space. And I'm very grateful for those founders. And I know too that in the beginning, when the task force itself was formed, it was called the LGBTQ Survivor Task Force, and it has since been kind of transformed and changed, and we now call it the LGBTQ Survivor Task Force. So can you talk a little bit about the decision to change it, why it was called LGBTQ Survivor Task Force in the first place?
Yeah, I think thank you for that question, because when we first started, there was I had written an article that sort of came out but anonymously about my experience, and then and then so many folks in our community said, also me, this also happened, me too, right? And then I came out a second time, but that was actually posted an article that had my name associated, that I came out and that this happened to me. And the original upswell of folks who were speaking out were predominantly gay and bi men. And so that's sort of who came together at the beginning to say, yeah, as gay men, as queer men, as non-binary, assigned male at birth folks, we've had these similar experiences. And then really in bringing in more non-binary folks to the space was Leah Wexler and Bix Marino Kibbe. We were also hearing more about, well, non-binary folks, yes, and women. And we were like, oh, well then, yes, obviously, if this is an issue that's impacting our entire community, then we need to address this as a community and not only focus on men. And so that was like that was a no-brainer. Like it was like maybe a few months in, we changed it because we were like, yeah, this needs to be about everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And right. And I think one of the things that just to, continue to use my personal privilege of having having these conversations with you before, Fern, is a lot of the services, the reason that it was like gay men first coming forward and joining and bi men was that so many of our services are built for women, and they're built for cisgender heterosexual women, but they're built for women, right? And so, we have the Violence Against Women Act, we have a lot of violence resources that are built for women and like nothing for men, if anything at all, right?
Yeah, and I'll pull back because I know that these were some questions about the origins, which unfortunately we weren't able to have some of our other founders here today. But yeah, I think that was part of the re-traumatization for these men, was that so many of the resources were for women and centered around women, and cisgender heterosexual women. And so when you're a gay man or somewhere in that gay, male, bi, non-binary, trans spectrum of sexual orientation, gender identity, but like centered on the male side, receiving these informations and dealing with folks who were so used to speaking with women, you hit this impasse of, well, everything is geared towards women, everything is gendered towards women, this isn't geared towards my experience. And even the service providers and folks who you deal with at every step were so used to dealing with women, and they were not used to dealing with gay men, that was just experience and re-traumatizing all over again. And I'll even go so far as to say there was a pamphlet or something I was given that said, well, you already probably feel a lot of shame because you're gay, and there's a lot of shame associated with being gay. So now that you've been raped, you're probably even feeling worse. And like, I'm paraphrasing it, but that's basically what the pamphlet said. And I was like, if this is the queer competent pamphlet, like, I feel like we can do better than this.
Yeah. And we can, and we've seen some people do better, and what we are building and continue to build, hopefully, is helping along those lines. So we were talking about how like gay men and bi men are vastly underserved by these agencies and services, and being that today is Bi Visibility Day, we know that our bi and pan siblings have the highest rates of sexual violence in the entire LGBTQ community and spectrum. And so I pulled some depressing statistics. One is that 75% of bisexual women will experience rape, sexual violence, or stalking in their lifetime. That's 3/4 of us, like that's almost all, right? And so, and 61% of folks, right? Like there's the 61% numbers there, and in comparison to the numbers for heterosexual women, it's 35%, right? So our bi women and lesbian women are both at like higher rates of sexual violence than our bi and pan siblings. And the same also, right? Like we have a lot of numbers, again, to the point of men being underserved, is that we don't have a lot of numbers or data about men who are victims of sexual violence. The little data that I have found does show that bi men are also at higher risk of experiencing sexual or relationship violence. And so given all of those, so it's like those are the statistics, the numbers. And this can be for Kathleen or Sarah or Fern. Why is that important? Why is it important that providers and the community both are aware of and know and understand the realities for bi plus folks who are victims of sexual and relationship violence?
Well, I can start by kind of sharing the provider perspective, and also as a pansexual identified survivor myself, and the reality that, especially within the mental health field or working as a provider, The work that I do within our agency, we serve survivors of human trafficking throughout San Diego County. And a lot of the work we do specifically, we have specialized services for male survivors as well as LGBTQ survivors. And something that I found when I started doing culturally responsive trainings around working with LGBTQ survivors is that many people would say, like, Kathleen, this is really interesting information, but we actually don't have anybody who identifies within the LGBTQ communities in our program. And, I'd always try not to laugh, but come back with, well, you do. You're probably just not asking the question in the right way, or you're not creating a space that feels safe enough for folks to disclose. And so kind of from the jump of the training, recognizing that people couldn't even acknowledge that they had queer folk in the space that they were providing services to first and foremost. And so then taking it this extra step further and helping people to understand, like, if you're not exploring these aspects of this person's identity, if you're not exploring these pieces, you may be missing huge areas of victimization, of vulnerability, of need for healing. If you just assume that every person who comes through this door is heterosexual and cisgender, you're missing huge aspects of that person's identity that are important, but also areas of healing that might need to happen. And I know for myself as a survivor, as someone who identifies as pan within that bi plus umbrella, I'm constantly in conversation with my friends who identify within that bi plus space of the reality that many of us experienced different types of sexual victimization within same-sex relationships, within non-same-sex relationships, right? And so we experienced victimization in a lot of different ways that might look a little bit different than some of our other queer siblings or heterosexual folks. And so having to acknowledge, how do you sit in the space of, did my trauma create my sexual orientation, or did it awaken in me the reality that I'm not a fan of that, or that I would prefer this instead? And so again, like, there's all of these really complicated things that come up around identifying within that bi plus umbrella, in addition to experiencing sexual violence, and the reality that many of us also really struggle with the way that gatekeeping exists within the queer community about, you're not straight enough or you're not queer enough, right? Like, oh, you're just dating that person until you find the right man, or, oh, you just haven't fully come out as lesbian yet, right? And so there's that other piece of victimization of constantly saying, well, if my victimization came at the hands of someone who was a different gender than I was, does that mean that I'm not bi? Does that mean that I'm straight as well? And so I think that's one of the reasons why the statistics are so important, and why it's so important to begin that conversation, right? If we're just, especially, we know that there are many more of us in that bi plus umbrella than really any other identity within the queer community. But oftentimes we go kind of overlooked because we're not as visible in the same way that other queer identities might be. And so another example of why it's so incredibly important for us to begin this process of really training providers and creating culturally responsive practice.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Kathleen is saying. And I'm approaching it from a little bit different of a perspective or a framework. I'm coming to this from a prevention framework. That's what my job is on a day-to-day basis, is I'm working primarily with high school age youth and sometimes college age folks doing prevention education. And so when we look at the historical field or track of prevention education, what we know is that it's often very binary, as are most things in this world. And so a lot of prevention education still is based on this, like, he said, she said, or it just continues to perpetuate that women are the only victims that experience sexual violence. And we know, right, like Jen already said the statistics, we know that that's not true. But it's interesting that even in 2020, I still see people within the field who talk about violence prevention in a really binary way that doesn't acknowledge the ways that people of all different gender identities, of all different sexual identities can experience sexual violence. And in particular, how that really does impact bi plus folks, right? And how their identities are erased, their experiences are erased. And like Kathleen said, there's so little visibility, which is why today is so important for bi plus people, right? I say that as a proud bisexual, and that's really, really important for people to know that. And also, we just continuously see this erasure of our community. And so when the community itself is erased, well, then how could violence exist if the community has never existed, right? So it's really important that providers, that preventionists, that community people know that bi folks exist and that the experiences we have of violence are real and valid.
Yeah.
I just wanted to also piggyback off of some of the I know we're focusing on the bi issue, but for gay men, bi men, pan men, there's this stigma that is associated of, we all like want sex all the time, and so you must have wanted it, and so why are you upset about it? And so there's that whole stigma there. And look, I've been a very sexually active person in my life. I'm not gonna, no shame about that. No slut shaming over here. Like, cool. And so helping even folks, providers, understand that there's a distinction, right, between a sex positive, sexually active person and when someone crosses a line of sexual violence and trauma. And I think even having to explain to some folks, like, I can dress slutty. I can, slutty. I can hit on you in a bar. I can want to bring you home. I can invite you into my bedroom. But there's a difference between that and inviting you into my body and inviting sexual contact, that those things are separate, and where the lines of consent are and helping people understand that are so important. And so destigmatizing that is destigmatizing sex positivity is, I think, a component of that. And I saw Marin Casada's question about how do you support gay and non-binary masculine folks? And I think part of it is educating yourself around what shame and stigma and fears exist about those folks. And how do we educate ourselves about being just community competent and culturally competent? And the other piece I want to add is San Diego in particular, we're a college town, we're a tourist town, we're a military town. So there's a lot of sort of inherent transience to our community. And that the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell happened, 9 years ago this last weekend, right? And that really kept folks in the closet and afraid to come out about sexual assault here in San Diego because they were afraid of losing their careers. And so there was a power dynamic that was there as well. And you look back to just June and the Title VII case, right? When you talk about employment and somebody coming out as a survivor, knowing that your employment may not even be secure after you come out about a sexual assault, that is a power dynamic. And so we still don't have federal protection really for housing. So housing and employment, I think, are really important power dynamic issues when we're talking about sexual assault. And you might not immediately make that correlation, right? But I think those are a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get into the kind of just what does the conference look like this year, just to dive in a little bit more to the communities and the numbers, right? So if we look at so we talked about bi+ folks, and if we also look at the intersections of race, gender identity, and ability, folks who live at those intersections, we know, are at an even higher risk of sexual violence and relationship violence. The American Academy of Pediatrics has said that gender nonconformity in childhood is a risk factor for sexual violence and childhood sexual abuse. Gender nonconforming kids who are assigned male at birth are 6 times more likely to be abused before age 18, right? And so if we look at those, all of those intersections, when you look at people of color, Black, Indigenous folks, when you look at people who have disabilities, what does it look like and what does it mean for both for the survivors who live life at those intersections and for the providers that are offering services and care to those survivors who live at those intersections? And I realize this question is not on our written list, but I just added it right now. So.
Well, I think I can start by sharing, I think a lot of the clients that we work with often meet those intersections of identifying within the LGBTQ communities, of identifying as both a sexual or gender minority, of identifying as a BIPOC individual, and also often having disabilities as well. Sometimes the disabilities coming from their trauma and victimization within trafficking, and sometimes have been before that, and maybe was a vulnerability to them experiencing some form of exploitation. But I think what consistently comes up for me across the board, regardless of the person I'm serving, but especially with the folks in those spaces of intersection, is that I can never make an assumption that I understand what it's like to be that person, or fully even what their needs are. Yes, I'm always going to be doing my best to be as competent as I can be in the services I provide, and as responsive as I can be about the way I tailor those services to the people that I work with. However, I'm not the expert in that person's life. And so it's my responsibility to center their identity and center their experience, to understand, what do we need to overcome together? How do we need to heal? How do we need to grow? Because what I think you might need to heal and grow from might be different than what you actually need right now, or what you want to focus on. And I'd rather focus on the spaces where you feel empowered and ready to make movement than the spaces that I'm gatekeeping, your ability to heal. I'm not a gatekeeper. I'm a facilitator of healing and change. And so I think for me, that's constantly what comes up with those individuals, because we do often have those folks in our services when we work with them, is that every single one of those intersectional identities impacts their ability to sustain themselves, impacts their ability to move forward with their ability to care for themselves, even with healing. And simultaneously, queer resilience is resistance. And you may have all of these identities and vulnerabilities and marginalizations, but that doesn't change the incredible inherent resiliency within you. And we can tap into that at any point in time. And so I think that's what comes up for me, is that trying to stay in this space of recognizing that not one identity is more important than another. They're all working together, and they're all kind of working to create this very specific, perfect storm for that individual. And it's my responsibility as the provider to show up and be culturally responsive. And if I don't know the answers, and if I don't know how to do that, it's not my client's responsibility to put that on them. It's my responsibility as the provider to go find that information in other spaces so that I can show up for them as best I can.
Yes, thank you for bringing in the theme of the conference this year, Kathleen. I'll talk about that more in a second. Sarah, go ahead.
Well, what comes to mind when you ask that question is, for folks that don't know, Center for Community Solutions, or CCS, is a dual organization that provides intervention and prevention services for intimate partner violence and sexual violence throughout San Diego. And so while I'm not on the intervention side of the house, I do work closely with helping our training manager facilitate our 66.5 hour crisis intervention training that really prepares our volunteers and our staff to be intervention staff, right, and to be advocates for survivors. And we have an entire section dedicated to what we consider cultural considerations, to really look at, how does race impact a survivor? How does disability impact a survivor? How does, queerness or being trans impact a survivor? And when I say impact, right, what are the systems of oppression that impact those identities that then further impact them as survivors? And so we really strive to prepare our staff and our volunteers to be, I won't say culturally competent, because I don't think that it's possible to be competent in any culture, even sometimes our own, right? I can't say that I know everything about what it means to be Latina, or everything about what it means to be bisexual or queer, right? I can't know those things. But we really want to strive to be culturally humble and to prepare our staff and volunteers to ask the questions that they need to, but not put that emotional labor onto survivors, to teach them, to educate them, to show them, like, this is what my identity means. And we really are intentional about that, especially within our department, which leans like heavily queer. And so for us, it's really, really important that we continuously educate our staff and volunteers and provide ongoing trainings in order for them to feel as prepared as they can be to work with any population. Again, of course, they can't know every single thing, but we really want to make sure that they walk away from our training knowing that they're going to work with different survivors, right, of different identities across the board. And like Kathleen said, it's never their job to say that I know what's better for you, especially if they're not of that community, right? It's never that person's job to say, I know what you need in order to heal, in order to feel safe, in order to receive justice, right? It's more about like, how can I help you as a survivor get to where you need to be? What is it that you need from me? We really believe in this empowerment model and not the savior model.
Excellent. Thank you both. Fern, did you have anything you wanted to add before I move into the conference?
Let y'all
All right.
go to the next.
So as I said, Kathleen mentioned our theme this year, which is queer resilience is resistance. And I firmly believe that. And that's, like definitely how I get my strength, and like the way that I kind of approach all of my activism is from that resilience of just being queer means that you're resilient. Being a queer survivor brings that resilience too, right? So the conference this year will be the third time that we've hosted the Me Too LGBTQ conference. It was originally scheduled for May, but pandemic. And so we took some time to kind of reimagine what it would look like in a virtual space. So it's coming to you this year on October 15th, 16th, and 17th. And so this will be, the third year, which means that it has, evolved as we've gone. So it started with the LGBTQ Survivor Task Force as just this group that was, doing the work. And then we're like, okay, a conference will be a good, one-day opportunity for providers to get that kind of knowledge, that understanding. And it's really evolved quite a lot. So I started at Pride right before the first conference, I think like a month before the first conference. And that one was very much geared towards providers, towards giving providers the tools to succeed and to serve our community a bit better. And it's evolved, right? So we now have, actually, I'm going to let Sarah or Kathleen or Fern talk a little bit about how it's evolved since the beginning. The first conference in whatever was 2018. 2018 was the first year.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Sure. What's time?
Well, so you're very right. So there were two tracks the first year, and the two tracks were focused. There was one focused on community members and survivors, to provide tools and education and help folks understand even what resources were available to them. And because we had started off doing some of the cross training between the two major organizations, being CCS and the LGBT Community Center, part of that conversation was, well, it can't just be these two organizations, right? These two organizations, as much as they're pillars of our community, we can't just leave it to these two to train and educate everyone. And so we had this conference, and that was actually the idea of how we even came about. Well, let's do a conference then and bring all these folks together. And we didn't know how many people were going to show up. And I think we had 118, 120 folks that first year. And, Jen, bless you for joining right before it started and here, help this land the plane. And it was great. And what we noticed that first year was we actually had very few community members, and we had an overwhelming outpour of service providers attend. And that sort of was like, okay, well, maybe, how do we shift gears? And so we even did a social, as odd as that kind of sounded. We did a Me Too social where that I felt like had a stronger presence of community, just general community members, as well as providers. And we came together and sort of even had, it was something like 40 folks come together just here at the Pride building talking about, okay, well, let's hear even more directly from a broader group of survivors, what issues came up and what you wanted to learn more about. And that really informed the second round of the conference.
And I think too, something that we found in that very first conference and the second one as well, but even in that very first conference was this intersection that we weren't really, I think we knew it cognitively, but maybe we didn't fully acknowledge it in our hearts, of the intersection of the number of providers that are also survivors, right? The number of queer providers that are also survivors. And so there was this weird kind of tension for many people of like, I want to learn more because I want to be a more equipped and competent provider, but also I'm a survivor who's trying to do my own healing. And how do I hold that space at the same time? And that was really hard for a lot of folks of trying to kind of grapple that tension of being here to be the professional to get my CEs. And also I just want to join in healing with my queer siblings for a moment around my experience. So that was definitely something that came up. And I think the second year, we had tried to definitely through a lot of different ways to meet some of the requests of the people who came to this social, because we got some great ideas. And I think also one of the things that was really encouraging about that social was we also had some allies who came from different environments, military spaces, law enforcement spaces that we weren't expecting people to show up. And we were like, why are you here? You want to participate? Come on in. Okay. And so I think that really created a space for us to have some conversations that we hadn't been having quite yet about how do we address the systemic issues around how folks experience marginalization because of their queerness, because of their Blackness, because of their disability, right? How do they experience those spaces? And so I think that was something that evolved through the planning process of the second conference, as well as feedback we received from the second conference of this desire and this hope to make our conference as representative and diverse as the community that we are attempting to serve and represent. But I think also another challenge that comes with that is the reality that many of us are still struggling with our own identity as victims or survivors, or whatever the specific term is that you want to identify with about your space of experiencing that kind of trauma. And so it's this weird juxtaposition where many of us are still grappling with our own identity as survivors, and we're not really ready to come out and share that. But simultaneously, we want to see people who look like us and experiences that sound and look like us. And so having to grapple with this reality of we're not trying to create a space for trauma porn at all. We don't want to do that. We're not doing that in the queer community. Sorry. That maybe previously we don't do that anymore. That's done. We want to focus on how we can move forward and how we can create resiliency and how we can really support people. And simultaneously, how do we help folks come to the table that really have some valuable things to share without people feeling like they're exploited, without people feeling like their voices aren't being heard? And so I think that was one of the really exciting things about this year, is that this year we took the conference national and we opened it up for national calls for submissions. Of course, good old COVID occurred, which is lovely as per usual. But I think in particular, like as that was occurring, we were getting these phenomenal pitches for ideas for presentations, all sorts of things, people coming forward and even saying, even now we have folks coming forward saying, hey, I know you're not accepting submissions anymore, but is there any way I can assist with my research or information I have to provide? And so I think that's been one of the most exciting things. We opened it up nationally, but then COVID happened, and now we have an opportunity to take it virtual, which means we have the opportunity to reach even more people, which I absolutely love. So Sarah, do you want to share a little bit about like kind of what it looks like this year? Because I mean, I'm so excited.
Sure. So I have to admit that I joined this in 2018, but as a presenter. So I've been able to see it evolve and be involved in it in different capacities. And this year, being on the committee, fully immersed in the committee this year, has been really incredible to see like our community come together and really want to support survivors. And I feel like this year, there's a lot more focus on healing and providing space for community members. There's absolutely a place for service providers to receive those CEs that Kathleen's talking about. And I feel like there's just so much focus on like, how do we as a community come together and heal from collective trauma, from being survivors, right? Like, how do we move forward? So our conference this year is going to be over the course of 3 days, and I'm really excited for it. Our first day really focuses on what is the state of the issue? Why are we here? Why do we even need a Me Too LGBTQ conference? And we have some really great plenaries that are happening and some panels that I don't know if you want me to share about just yet, or should I hold on that?
Go for it.
I think it's up to you all. Go for it. Okay, so we have a really great art panel that I'm excited about because we haven't really introduced art into this conference at all in the past 2 years. And I really want to see, how do people who are using art to heal and to do activism come together? And that is, I'm so stoked about that panel that's going to happen
Sarah,
on Thursday.
The earrings I'm wearing are actually
Yes.
one of the artists who will be on that panel. My non-binary earrings are one of our artists who is a woodworker, trans and also non-binary, local, San Diego local, person of color. Absolutely love it. We'll be plugging all their sites, of course, too, because we want to give our queer artists lots of extra income if we can.
That's really cool. I'll have to check them out, so please send it to me. But on Friday, we're going to really focus on service providers, making sure that they are also getting the information that they need in order to be culturally responsive to queer and trans communities. And then Saturday is really focusing on community. And there's 4 incredible workshops that are looking at how can we move forward from our trauma and really start to heal. And I'm just so excited. I mean, the workshops are really incredible. And we have one in particular, Mirror Memoirs, that is being put on that I'm so it's so amazing to see how this is going to come out. But this one workshop in particular is a closed space for folks who identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color that have experienced sexual abuse before the age of 18. And when I think about that, this space has been created intentionally for folks to come together. I just think that's such an amazing thing, right? That we have a space dedicated for folks to really work through this together. I mean, I just can't get over it, honestly. Like, I thought that was such an impressive submission that we got, and I was so glad that we were able to offer them a spot in our conference. It's just really phenomenal, like everything that came together this year and who we are bringing to this conference. And the fact that it is virtual means that we really can, like Kathleen said, reach so many people. You know, there were so many barriers in, I think, when we were first planning this and we were opening it up nationally, that we were like, well, what if presenters can't get to California, to San Diego, right? It's really expensive to fly here. How are we going to support people to like come here? And now we can literally have people from all over the world come to this conference. And I think that's just really incredible.
Yeah, and as somebody who's attended 1, 2, maybe 3 different events that were Mirror Memoirs circles, I can tell y'all it is a powerful, amazing space. And this seems like the perfect opportunity. I was trying to figure out when I get to make this announcement. But we, if you follow our Instagram at MeTooLGBTQ, you saw that yesterday we posted a teaser that we would be announcing our keynote speaker today, September 23rd. So our keynote speaker this year is Jaden Fields, who's currently the co-director of Mirror Memoirs, along with the founder, Amita Swadin. And Jaden is incredible. I am so excited for you all to hear from him. And so, big announcement. I was going to do a drum roll, but I forgot. I got too excited. So yeah, so I'm really excited for you all to see Jaden on, and that'll be on the first day, on Thursday, the 15th. So we have, I think we should be good with the questions we have left. So one of the tracks that was mentioned is the provider track. And it's kind of, this is for Kathleen, who's kind of coordinating that provider track. And, you know, one of the things that I heard from providers, as you were talking, Kathleen, about those who share the identities of both provider and survivor and queer person, is that, you know, you have to kind of like segment yourselves. And that's really difficult to do in a space where, you know, you have the community track running simultaneously with the provider track, so you have to choose, right? And so, right, so this time, because of the virtual platform, we're able to kind of really section it up in a way that I'm hopeful is really helpful for those providers who want to access all of the pieces of their identity, right? But, you know, as a queer survivor, you have to kind of compartmentalize in a way, right? So, Kathleen, if you can talk a little bit more about, and I think we've talked a little bit already about why it's important for providers to have these understandings, humility, responsiveness, and why is it important for this track to exist?
Yeah, and you know, I think This provider track was definitely, I think, kind of the original focus of this conference, of this goal of wanting to increase the ability of providers to serve queer survivors. But I think something in particular this year that we've been really intentional about, even before the death of George Floyd, even before kind of the initial reinsurgence of the social justice protests and things that have been occurring across the nation, we were already in a space where we were very much feeling like we wanted to address the systemic racism and marginalization that exists within the mental health field and exists within the mental health space, and even how queerness itself has been pathologized throughout the history of mental health, right? And so, like, even if we just look at the history of it, right, it's rooted in racism, it's rooted in homophobia, it's rooted in transphobia, and all of these pieces. We won't even get into J.K. Rowling's new book and all of the drama, right? We'll just desirable, undesirable, number one, set that one over there, right? But so I say that to say, like, that is still so pervasive in our culture and within kind of our normal understanding of reality. And so those biases seep into every single one of us. A provider, just because they have letters behind their name, just because they went to school, doesn't mean that they're not racist, doesn't mean that they're not homophobic, doesn't mean that they're not transphobic. And, something that I really love, one of the artists will have speaking with us on the first day for the Artivism panel, Cameo Adele, actually put out this really fantastic video about this idea of not referring to yourself as saying, like, I'm not racist, because we're all on this level of continuum of understanding and unlearning the racism that we've internalized and the marginalization we've internalized. And so it's the same for providers. Even if we're a queer survivor, even if we're a person of color, even if we are Black or Indigenous, it doesn't change the reality that each one of us has internalized this marginalization about how we understand ourselves and how we understand the world. And so one of the things we were really intentional with this year is that we wanted to create a panel to talk about anti-racist considerations for care when we're serving QD BIPOC survivors. And so one of the first things that we'll have on the provider track day is we will have a group of providers, folks who are educators, folks who are mental health clinicians, folks who are clergy and advocates throughout the community, multiple different identities being represented through queer identities, through gender minorities, through racial minorities as well, lots of different folks talking about a couple of things. So first, talking about how do I ensure that I am creating policies and procedures and even ways that I conceptualize my cases in spaces that address anti-racist bias here. Like, how do I do that? First of all, how am I exploring my caseload? And how am I conceptualizing those pieces? But then also, in addition to that, recognizing, again, like we talked about in the beginning, many of us who are providers for the queer community also meet a lot of those same intersectional identities as well. And so how do you, as a provider of color and also a survivor, potentially, how do you hold space for a survivor of color in that moment? How do you do that work? How do you care for yourself? In my own space of privilege, I am a white passing, cis passing, het passing individual. I do identify as a person of color, as a biracial individual. And the reality is for myself that my identities as a white passing person of color are not the same as the client that I work with that doesn't pass, right? And so I have to be able to acknowledge and hold how colorism impacts the way I provide services, how the internal racism that I have, kind of internalized within myself, how does that impact how I see this client? And I understand their need for healing and well-being. And so really wanting to talk about that in a different way that we haven't before in the past. So we're really excited about that panel in particular. And then we also have two additional provider tracks that we'll have breakouts for. One is kind of a foundational cultural humility space, best practices in working with survivors. And the other one will be specific to talking about utilizing movement to create healing for survivors of sexual trauma specifically. And we have some fantastic clinicians who are here throughout all of California who are going to be providing some of those breakout sessions for us. But I think, again, the need for the community track has been so incredible, and we've been exploring ways to expand that. And I think we always still come back to this space of our initial goal was to help increase the ability of our community to serve survivors. And so how do we continue to do that? And how do we continue to do that in a way that's responsive to the needs of the time and the needs of our community? Because here in San Diego, especially, our queer community is a very, very, very diverse group of people. And so if we are not addressing racism, if we are not addressing anti-Blackness, if we are not addressing anti-transness within the work we do, we're never going to rise if we're not all rising together.
And there's Kathleen also bringing in San Diego Pride's 2020 theme of Together We Rise. I had no idea you were going to be so on brand today. This is amazing. Right, and so one of the other new tracks this year, or the new track this year, is our youth track. So last year we had a few youth who were really excited about conference, really wanted to go. And they were part of and connected to Pride Youth Program. So, we did what we could to prepare them for the space and prepare them in the space. But ultimately, the past two conferences have not been built for youth, right? And that's a different space. So we're adding that youth track this year. So Sarah, if you can talk a little bit about, the ages that it's appropriate for, like who the audience is in youth, and, what does that look like this year?
Yeah, I'm happy to share. So our youth track is, again, completely brand new. We heard our youth last year loud and clear when they said that they wanted to have a space in this conference as well. And we know that that's important because we know that young people are also experiencing sexual violence and teen dating violence. And so we wanted to create a space where youth could be part of this conference. So the youth track will be for youth ages 13 to 18 years old. All youth are more than welcome to it, but we are centering the identities of queer and trans youth. And so we have some really cool pieces to the youth track that we will be doing. So one of the pieces will be around art and resilience, again, really incorporating this art piece into this conference, because so many young people really love to use art for healing, but also just for expression, right? And so we want to honor that a lot of young people really need and love and value art. And so how can they incorporate that into their lives? We will also be doing a training on how do we actually manage our brains when trauma is happening? So this is all about the community resiliency model that is by the Trauma Resource Institute. And so we are looking at how do we navigate and manage our biological stressors that happen as a result of a trigger? How do we manage our emotions and use actual neurobiology to back that up? And so I'm really excited. I will be co-facilitating that with my colleague Sabrina Van Zuden. And we will be talking about how can we manage our stressors when this happens for us. But I think really largely this space is being cultivated in a way that centers young people. So Sabrina Van Zuden and then Finn Burgess, I think, are really taking a big part of this conference, or this track in particular, and are really working to create a space where they are the go-to for young people. They are the ones that will answer questions and be there to help them throughout this entire conference, because youth are able to attend on the first and the last day, so Thursday and Saturday. And I really admire what they did as to also young people who are creating a space for other young people.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I'm just so stoked for this youth track. Finn is one of our youth ambassadors as well. So they are a whole of 16 years old, and they have taken the lead in a really amazing way on this youth track. So I'm really excited to see what it looks like, and to be able to create that space for our queer and trans youth. I think it's gonna be really powerful. So I have one last big question, and then we'll do a closing, any last words. And I will admit that I stole this question from Amita Swadin, who is the founder of Mirror Memoirs. And it's one of the questions that they ask in the oral history that is the kind of the basis of Mirror Memoirs. And it's my favorite question in that entire, I think they have 30 questions that they ask throughout that oral history process. So if you can imagine for a second a world without sexual or relationship violence, what does that world look like? What does it include? And what does it not include? I'll let whoever has their answer ready go ahead and start. Or I'll just cold call. Fern.
That's a rough one because it's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it has to do so much with a lot of the education and advocacy work that we're all doing. And it really impacts every sector and every industry. And part of it has to do with the elimination of closets. And I love this phrase of cultural humility and this sort of compassionate approach to the diversity that exists within humanity. And it's really like, it's that fundamental, but we see subjugation and oppression happen, whether it is through and with particular regard to our community, meaning the LGBTQ community, or sexual diverse and gender diverse folks, that there's so much shame and stigma that is placed upon us, and that really happens from a very, very young age. From cradle to grave, we are faced with the straight washing, the cis washing, the whitewashing of reality, and our history and education and media. And how does media perpetuate rape culture? How does patriarchal institutions and racist institutions perpetuate rape culture? And how do those power dynamics really impact what it is rape culture? And I think that in order to repair a lot of this, we need to have equity under the law. For the LGBTQ community, right? I talked about how issues of employment and housing impact these closets and allow for the harm and victimization of marginalized communities to perpetuate, and how those behaviors perpetuate themselves. And I love the conversations around how we're saying that intersectional identities, the victimization can happen that much more, not because there's anything inherently wrong with being from those communities, but because of the intentional and systemic barriers that have been put in place, right? They are marginalized. It's an act that is happening to people. And so it's a removal of the closets. It's a holistic compassion to folks, regardless of their gender expression or the way that they hope to express love and intimacy with folks of the same gender or gender diverse folks. In looking at the ways that we've institutionalized and criminalized race and national origin. And we didn't really get to the place where we were talking about the impacts of being undocumented, right? But that's a whole other, being in a border town, that's also one of the big issues that I think we're facing here in San Diego, is that folks, depending on your race, right, the color of your skin, if you're Black, you may not want to call 911 because of what that might mean when you call 911. If you're undocumented, or even if you're not, but you're Latino, if you're brown, calling 911 in the case of an emergency or seeking help from an institution that has historically oppressed and marginalized you is a complicated thing. And I think that it also goes to education. We have to include diverse communities in K through 12 education, right? We have to, which breeds better understanding and cultural humility. I love that phrase. And we have to have sex education that is queer and trans competent, and consent-based sex education. And even from a young age, we need to be talking about what body autonomy is and what consent is. And so, sorry, that was a bigger answer. I mean, it's a huge thing. It's all of it. And I guess that's my answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not okay, my world looks like this, period, end of story, right? This is an imaginative and generative question, which is part of why I love it so much. Sarah, Kathleen.
Oh, goodness. As a preventionist, I have to believe that this world truly, truly exists. And as a sex educator, I also firmly believe in comprehensive sex ed. But when I envision a world without sexual violence or relationship violence, I envision a world where bodies, literal bodies, are valued, right? Black bodies, Indigenous bodies, disabled bodies, fat bodies, immigrant bodies, right? Like I view a world where our bodies come before profit, that people come before profit, that capitalism doesn't exist, where people can live like their true selves and be authentic and have liberation in a way that makes sense for them. I don't think it's on me to say what liberation looks like for individuals, but I think if we had a world that valued human lives before money, before anything, we wouldn't have a world where violence happened against bodies.
I absolutely agree with everything that Fernando and Sarah have said. Yes, check all those boxes 100%. I think the only other thing that comes up for me is that when I think about the idea of envisioning this world without sexual or relationship violence, that's not possible without removing racism. And so to me, I see this world without sexual and relationship violence also being a space without the patriarchy, without racism, without all of those additional marginalized pieces. We can't, everything's connected, right? This is a symptom of an infection, right? It's like a fever is a symptom of an infection. It's a sign of something worse in our society. And so to me, when I envision that, I envision a space where, just like Sarah said, bodies are being valued, but I also envision this space of freedom where people actually feel safety for the first time in their lives. Something we really struggle with when we work through trauma with people is helping them establish a sense of safety. But what's that look like when you're a marginalized individual, when you have all these additional intersectional identities of queerness, of being BIPOC, of being disabled, of being undocumented, of English not being your first language, right? All of these different pieces that come together to create this specific marginalization for that individual. I can't really help someone fully heal from their trauma when safety isn't an option in the society that we live in because of the identities they hold. And so to me, a world without sexual and relationship violence includes all of those other isms that we talk about being erased at the same time too. And I am so excited because I know that that's the work that all of us on this call and even folks in the chat and tuning in today are working towards as well.
Well, that was beautiful. God, I just love you three so much. And what a great beginning of the end of our segment. So as we close, I want to give you all the opportunity to offer up some national or local resources that you'd like to share. Specifically, Kay and Sarah, if you want to plug your organizations, feel free. And any other like just big resources you want to make sure folks know about.
So I'll just mention our agency, North County Lifeline. We are located up in the northern end of San Diego County, but we do have programs throughout the entire county as well. Specifically, the program that I work with that is working with the Me Too LGBTQ conference is the Project Life program, and we work with survivors of human trafficking throughout San Diego County, all ages, all genders, all forms of exploitation, and all documentation statuses as well. So if you are an individual needing services, please reach out to us. I'd also just like to plug as well a couple of national organizations like Blackline as an example of a fantastic mental queer, specifically focusing on Black and Indigenous identities as centering in the space. But if you're looking for peer support, if you're looking for additional resources, and then lastly, for folks who are looking for assistance with things like mutual aid, this year we are partnering with Solve for X, which is a local mutual aid foundation or organization here in San Diego County of predominantly focusing on centering cutie BIPOC identities and providing mutual aid. So if you search Solve for X, you can also search Solve for X through Venmo as well. They are on Instagram. You can access their page. If you have extra money to give, please. There's always requests that are happening that folks aren't able to provide. This year, as a conference, we are actually partnering with Solve for X to create a fund specifically for survivor-based needs. And so again, if you are looking to access funds or if you have some extra money and you're looking to give back to the community, another fantastic organization to reach out to as well.
And those of you that register for the conference, you'll also get that information about Solve for X's special fund as we get closer to the day. Sarah, go ahead.
And for those in San Diego, Center for Community Solutions provides prevention and intervention services for intimate partner violence and sexual violence throughout most of the county. We do have 3 main offices, one in Pacific Beach, one in Escondido, and then one in El Cajon. And we also serve some of the campuses throughout San Diego. And we provide advocacy, legal support. We have shelter, and our shelters and all of our services are open to all people, regardless of gender, sexual identity, immigration status, etc. We serve all people. And then for folks who are outside of San Diego, you can check out the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, calcasa.org, or the Rape and Abuse Incest Network, which is RAINN, RAINN.org, to find a service provider that's in your area. And you can also check us out on Instagram at CCS_prevents for some prevention education, which is what I do to help kind of move us towards a world without violence.
Sarah does a great job on that Instagram. Highly recommend following. Fern, did you have any resources you wanted to plug before we do last words?
I'm good.
Okay. Well, do you want to start with any last parting words as we close out?
I just wanted to say thank you to the committee for continuing to work so diligently through the pandemic. Just love our queer resilience, love our community, and it's been about a little over 7 years since my journey to helping this all be something that existed in the world started. And I never could have believed that it would have grown so much. And I know that Christopher would be really proud, and was. And I'm so proud of you all. And I'm lucky to know you and work with you. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, thank you, Fern. Kay or Sarah, any final words?
I'm just really grateful to be in community with you all, to be part of this amazing committee with you all, and to just keep doing the work, even on the hardest of days. Like, I have such incredible people behind me that are like, we can do this, and we can really create a world where violence doesn't exist.
I agree. I've been so honored to work with the folks on the committee. And I think the final word that I would just give is, for folks who are watching, we can't really create that world that we're envisioning without you. We can't create that space and that change without you, right? We are the facilitators of change, but we're not the gatekeepers. We need you. We need your voice. We need your passion. We need your presence. And so for folks who are watching, if you are part of the queer community and you're a survivor and you are passionate about this, please reach out to us, because we are always looking for folks on our planning committee. Next year is coming up, and we've got to figure out how to start planning that one as soon as this one is done. I just felt my chest get really tight. I'm going to shift to something else now. Just get my wiggles out. But I say all that to say, we can't do this work without you. You are the vessel. You are the voice. You are the light and the passion and the fire that we need. And so my last words is that I want to thank everybody who tuned in today. And also, I just want to remind you that, it starts with us. And so if you are in a space where you are feeling enlivened, empowered, activated by this, please reach out to us and help us end this problem. It takes all of us to solve sexual and relationship violence. So thank you for tuning in.
Thank you so much. So thank you, the three of you, for joining us today and sharing the space with our community, our full community. Gosh, I just love you so much. And thank all of you for joining us as well, everyone who's tuned in. And so here's your last plug of the conference. So you can, you'll see on the bottom of the screen, registration is open at that website, sdpride.org/MeTooLGBTQ. You can also see all of the information that you might possibly need for the conference itself, the program, the speakers, the registration form. It is free for youth, sliding scale for community members and survivors. And it is there are scholarships available for providers. Otherwise, provider fee runs from $20 to $70, and that includes CE credits as well. So please go ahead and register. I'm telling you, this conference is going to be amazing this year. I'm truly just so excited. If I wasn't running it, I would be excited to go. And I'm still excited to go. So again, thank you. Find more information on that Me Too LGBTQ website and follow us on Instagram at Me Too LGBTQ.